The Bloody Lake. The hidden lake had always been my sanctuary, a secret haven tucked away from the world where I could lose myself in the peaceful art of fishing. For years, I had left my kayak leaning against the gnarled old oak tree at the water's edge, confident in the solitude of this forgotten place. But on that warm summer evening, as twilight crept across the water, my illusion of safety was shattered in the most horrifying way imaginable. I had been out on the lake for about an hour, the cooler beside me already holding a few plump trout. The last remnants of daylight were fading fast, painting the sky in deep purples and reds that seemed to bleed into the calm surface of the water. It was then that I heard it, a strange, sloshing sound coming from the shore. Turning towards the noise, my blood ran cold at the sight before me. A figure stood at the water's edge, tipping an enormous barrel into the lake. Even in the fading light, I could see the dark liquid pouring out, staining the pristine waters with an ominous red tinge. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice echoing across the suddenly too quiet lake. "What are you doing?" The figure's head snapped up, and for a moment, our eyes locked. Even at this distance, I could see the wild, feral look in their gaze. Without a word, they dropped the barrel and bolted into the woods, leaving behind only the rhythmic splash of whatever vile substance they had been dumping into my beloved lake. As I paddled closer, the coppery scent hit me like a physical blow. My stomach churned as the horrible realization dawned: this was blood. Gallons and gallons of blood, now seeping into the once clear waters. Fear gripped me as I made my way back to shore, my mind racing with terrifying possibilities. Who was that person? What kind of monster dumps barrels of blood into a secluded lake? And most chillingly, whose blood was it? As I dragged my kayak onto the bank, a twig snapped in the woods behind me. I froze, every nerve in my body screaming danger. Slowly, I turned, half expecting to see the figure lunging at me from the shadows. But the forest remained still, watching me with dark, secretive eyes. I grabbed my gear and practically ran towards the road, constantly looking over my shoulder. The whole way home, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of predatory eyes following my every move. That night, as I lay awake in bed, jumping at every creaking floorboard and rustling leaf, a knock at the door nearly stopped my heart. Through the window, I could make out a silhouette, broad-shouldered, menacing. A deep voice called out, "Excuse me, I think you saw me at the lake earlier." I'd just like to explain myself. Ice flooded my veins. How had he found me? How did he know where I lived? I remained silent, praying he would think the house was empty and leave. But he persisted, his voice growing more insistent with each unanswered knock. "Sir, if you could just open the front door, I'll explain everything to you." When I finally found my voice, it came out as a strangled whisper. "Leave, or I'll call the police." For a moment, silence fell. Then, to my horror, I heard the distinct sound of breaking glass from downstairs. He was inside. With trembling hands, I grabbed the gun from my closet, positioning myself behind the dresser with a clear view of the bedroom door. Heavy footsteps creaked up the stairs, slow and deliberate, as if savoring each moment of terror they instilled in me. The door handle turned agonizingly slowly, and as it swung open, I found myself face to face with my pursuer. In the dim light, I could make out wild eyes and a face streaked with what looked horribly like dried blood. "Don't move," I shouted, my voice steadier than I felt as I trained the gun on him. "Drop whatever you're holding and get on the ground." For a heartbeat, he seemed to consider rushing me. But then, with eerie calmness, he said, "I'm leaving," and turned to flee. I followed him downstairs, my gun trained on his back, watching as he disappeared into the night through the shattered living room window. As soon as he was gone, I collapsed to the floor, my whole body shaking with delayed terror and adrenaline. The police arrived soon after, but despite an extensive search, no trace was found of the intruder or the mysterious barrels by the lake. To this day, I'm haunted by unanswered questions. What sinister purpose lay behind those barrels of blood? Was it part of some dark ritual, or something even more horrifying? I've since moved away from that house, away from the hidden lake and its blood-stained waters. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still jolt awake, convinced I can hear the slow drip of liquid hitting water and heavy footsteps creeping up my stairs. And I wonder, will I ever truly be free of the horror I witnessed that night? Or is it only a matter of time before the man from the lake finds me again, ready to finish whatever gruesome task I interrupted? The tribal terror. Fishing had always been more than just a hobby in our family. It was a sacred tradition, passed down through generations like a cherished heirloom. From the moment I could hold a rod, I was inducted into this aquatic brotherhood, learning the ways of the water from my father, Uncle Matthew, and their close friends Rich, Jeff, and Monty. But on that fateful day, what should have been another memory-making expedition turned into a nightmare that would haunt us all for years to come. We set out before dawn, the boat cutting through the mist rising off the water as we made our way to a secluded cove known for its abundant bass. It was a spot few bothered to explore, requiring a couple of hours of navigation through treacherous waters to reach. As we anchored in the familiar cove, surrounded by dense, primordial forest, none of us could have imagined the horrors that awaited us. The day passed in a haze of laughter, storytelling, and the occasional celebration as someone reeled in a particularly impressive catch. Monty, true to form, cracked open the first beer before the sun had fully risen, setting the tone for a day of steady drinking that would prove to be our undoing. As dusk approached, an unnatural fog began to roll in from the water. It was unlike anything any of us had ever seen, thick, oppressive, seeming to swallow the very light around us. Rich, the most experienced among us, kept muttering about how he'd never encountered fog so dense in all his years on the water. The eerie silence that descended with the fog set our nerves on edge. Gone were the usual sounds of the forest and water, replaced by an unnatural stillness that seemed to press in on us from all sides. As darkness fell, it became clear that waiting out the fog was no longer an option. Matthew attempted to navigate the boat out of the cove, but the impenetrable wall of mist made it nearly impossible. After a few heart-stopping near misses with the rocky shore, we were forced to accept the grim reality. We would have to spend the night here, trapped in this otherworldly fog. Desperate to contact our families and explain our absence, my father volunteered to go ashore in search of a cell signal. Rich and Jeff agreed to join him, while Matthew stayed behind to guard the boat and keep an eye on an increasingly inebriated Monty. Armed with only our phone flashlights and a handful of emergency flares, we made our way onto the eerily silent shore. The fog seemed to cling to us, its tendrils reaching out as if trying to pull us deeper into the unknown. We began our trek uphill, hoping the elevation would provide better reception. That's when we heard it, a series of clicking noises, unlike anything I'd ever encountered in the wilderness. At first, it seemed to come from directly in front of us, but within moments, the sound had encircled us completely. It was rhythmic yet erratic, as if someone, or something, was tapping out a code meant only for the forest itself. Rich, his voice tight with barely controlled fear, whispered urgently for us to turn off our flashlights. "Don't give away our position," he hissed, the genuine concern in his tone chilling me to the bone. As the darkness closed in around us, the clicking noises stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow even more terrifying, pressing down on us with an almost physical weight. Time seemed to stand still as we stood there, frozen, our minds racing with horrific possibilities. Then, without warning, the silence was shattered by a guttural scream that echoed through the trees. It was a sound of pure anguish and rage, so primal and inhuman that it rooted us to the spot. Before we could process what was happening, the sound of rapidly approaching footsteps thundered through the woods towards us. Panic took over. We ran blindly back the way we had come, branches whipping at our faces as we crashed through the underbrush. My father, in a moment of desperate brilliance, fired one of the flares behind us. For a split second, the woods were illuminated in a hellish red glow, and the sight that met our eyes was nothing short of nightmarish. Illuminated by the flare's light were more than a dozen figures dressed in what could only be described as tribal attire. Some brandished wooden spears, others had faces painted in terrifying patterns. But it was their eyes that truly haunted me, wild, feral, filled with an inhuman hunger that sent shivers down my spine. The light faded as quickly as it had appeared, plunging us back into darkness. But the image of those creatures was seared into my mind. We ran faster than I thought possible, our lungs burning and hearts pounding as we fled through the pitch-black forest. By some miracle, we burst out of the tree line and onto the shore where our boat was anchored. We screamed at Matthew to start the engine, our voices filled with a terror that brooked no argument. As the boat lurched forward, my father fired the last flare into the air. In that final, terrible moment of illumination, we saw our pursuers reach the water's edge. There were even more of them than I had first thought. At least 15 grotesque figures, standing motionless at the shoreline, their eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light in the flare's glow. As darkness fell once more and Matthew guided the boat to safety, we sat in stunned silence, each of us trying to process the horror we had just witnessed. What were those things? Some lost tribe, cut off from civilization? Or something far more sinister and supernatural? Even now, years later, the memory of that night sends chills down my spine. I've never returned to those waters, and I doubt I ever will. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear that rhythmic clicking coming from just outside my window. And I wonder, did we truly escape that night? Or did we unknowingly bring something back with us, something ancient and malevolent that's been biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? The sunken secret. Fishing has been my lifeline for as long as I can remember, a constant companion through the ups and downs of my 60 years on this earth. With my children grown and the house fallen silent, I found solace in the quiet communion between man and nature that only fishing can provide. It was a crisp April morning when I set out for a secluded lake deep in the heart of upstate New York. The early season, just after ice out, promised the potential for some spectacular catches. As I unstrapped my kayak from the car roof in the pre-dawn darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that this day would be different somehow. I paddled out to the center of the lake just as the first hints of sunrise began to paint the sky. The world was still, peaceful, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air, as if the lake itself was holding its breath in anticipation. As I prepared to cast my line, movement on the far shore caught my eye. Curious, I reached for my binoculars, focusing on 3 shadowy figures dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by hoods. They appeared to be digging at the water's edge, their movements furtive and purposeful. A chill ran down my spine as I watched them unearth several objects from the hole, objects I couldn't quite make out even with my binoculars. But it was what happened next that truly set my heart racing. They began tossing these mysterious items into the lake, each one making a distinct splash as it hit the water. Every instinct told me to paddle away, to pretend I had seen nothing. But a lifetime of fishing had instilled in me a deep respect for these waters, and the thought of someone polluting them filled me with a righteous anger that overrode my fear. I waited until the figures had disappeared into the woods before cautiously making my way to the spot where they had been. For an hour, I fished that area, not for bass or trout, but for whatever dark secrets those strangers had tried to consign to the depths. Just as I was about to give up, my line caught on something solid. With trembling hands, I reeled in my catch, my breath catching in my throat as I saw what dangled from my hook. A sleek, black 9mm pistol, its metal glinting ominously in the morning light. My blood ran cold as the implications sank in. This was no simple case of littering. Whatever I had stumbled upon was far more sinister, and potentially far more dangerous. I called the police immediately, insisting on staying to watch as they dredged the area. What they found chilled me to the bone: more weapons, a set of keys, foreign coins wrapped in cloth, and most disturbingly, a locket containing faded photographs of unknown individuals. The officers assured me they would investigate, but something in their eyes told me they didn't expect this case to be solved. As I drove home that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled upon something much bigger and more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. Days later, as I sat in my darkened living room, voices from outside froze the blood in my veins. "That was the car, I know it," a gruff voice muttered, followed by the sound of multiple people circling my house. They never knocked, never announced themselves, just prowled around like predators sizing up their prey before melting back into the night. Since that day, I found myself jumping at shadows, scrutinizing every unfamiliar face I see in town. Was I being paranoid, or had my innocent fishing trip somehow entangled me in a web of crime I couldn't begin to understand? The questions haunt me still. Why were those items buried, only to be dug up and thrown into the lake? What dark deeds were tied to that gun, those keys, that locket? And most chillingly, do the owners of those objects know that I was the one who found them? Every time I approach the water's edge now, I can't help but wonder what other secrets lie beneath the surface. And as I cast my line into the depths, a part of me fears that one day, instead of a fish, I might reel in something far more terrifying, or that something might reach up from the depths to drag me down into the dark, watery grave where all secrets eventually come to rest. The midnight stalker. The thrill of the catch had always been my driving force, pushing me to seek out new fishing spots and challenges. But on that fateful October night, as the crisp autumn air carried the promise of a bountiful striper haul, I could never have imagined the terror that awaited us on that desolate stretch of beach. Kevin, Arian, and I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. With our usual fishing spot unavailable, Kevin had suggested a secluded beach about 15 minutes from our shore house. The drive there was eerie, a narrow, winding road flanked by dense woods that seemed to press in on us from all sides. We arrived at a small gravel lot just as true darkness fell. Kevin insisted we take everything we needed in one trip, as the walk to the beach was a good 5 minutes through a twisting path. Little did we know, this decision would leave us terrifyingly vulnerable to what was to come. The beach was vast and empty, stretching out before us like an alien landscape under the starlight. We set up our camp, chairs, coolers, and Kevin's impressive array of fishing gear. The rods stood like sentinels in the sand, small bells attached to alert us of any bites. For the first few hours, everything was perfect. The fish were biting, the beer was flowing, and our laughter echoed across the empty expanse of sand and sea. But as the night wore on, an unsettling feeling began to creep over me, a sense that we were not as alone as we had thought. It was Arian who first noticed something amiss. He suddenly went quiet, cocking his head to the side as if straining to hear something. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice tight with tension. It sounded like someone yelled. We brushed it off at first, attributing it to the wind or the crash of waves. But Arian's unease was contagious, and soon we found ourselves peering into the darkness, jumping at every rustle of wind through the dune grass.